My Brother Sam is Dead by James Lincoln Collier. Chapter 7. The summer of 1776 came and went. I tried to keep away from Mr. Heron. If I saw him coming into the tavern, I'd go out to clean the barn or down to the woodlot to do some chopping. But a few times he took me by surprise before I could get away. He never said anything about the letter at all. He'd just say, "Hello, Timothy," or "It's a fine day, isn't it, Timothy?" And I'd say, "Yes, sir," or something like that, and get away as soon as I could. I couldn't figure out what he thought about the whole thing, and finally I just forgot about it. The war went on. It didn't seem to have much to do with us most of the time, aside from Sam being gone. Of course, food was short, and other things too. The men who still had their guns had trouble getting powder and shot. Cloth was getting more scarce and leather because the Continental troops needed them for clothing and shoes. But nobody was really desperate. Sometimes we would be reminded of the war when militiamen marched through, or we might see a soldier who had been wounded or whose enlistment was up walking back to his home. But mostly the war stayed away from us. Twice we got letters from Sam, or rather Mother did. One came in August of that year and another one in September. The first one told about the fighting in New York. The rebel troops had been beaten there and the British had taken over the city. But the way Sam wrote about it, he made it seem like a glorious victory for the rebels. He said that his regiment had made a magnificent retreat and the British were lucky they got out of it alive. But it sounded the other way around to me. The second letter didn't tell so much, except that they were in camp someplace in New Jersey and probably would stay there for the winter. He was living a hard life. A lot of times they were on very short rations, eating just hardtack and water day after day. They didn't have proper clothing either. Some of the men had no shoes and went barefoot. In cold weather, they wrapped cloth around their feet to keep from freezing. I guess there wasn't much glory in it a lot of the time, but Sam said that their spirits were high. Mother and Father had a fight over the letters. When the first one came, Mother decided to answer it. Father said no. She shouldn't encourage Sam in his recalcitrance. Mother argued with him, but he wouldn't give in. Let Sam feel our disapproval until he comes to his senses. But then when the second letter came, she said she was going to write an answer regardless. They had an argument about it when I was supposed to be asleep. I kept hoping Mother would win. It made me sad to think of Sam writing letters and nobody writing back, although I guess Betsy Reed would write back. But Father didn't feel that way. The boy has to learn a lesson. He's far too headstrong. He isn't a boy anymore, Mother said. He's 16 years old. That's a boy, Susanna. He's 17, Life. How old were you when you left home? That was different, he growled. There were 8 of us, remember? Too many mouths to feed as it was. Still, you went off at 16, Life. Sam's too headstrong. And you're not? I'm his father. I don't have to be questioned on my behavior. Mother laughed. You hate having anyone tell you what to do, yet you expect Sam to let you order him around. I'm going to write to him, Life. He must surely be worried that we're all right. I don't want you to do it, Susanna. I know you don't, Life, but I'm going to do it anyway. I heard Father make a grunting sound, and then the door banged, and he stomped out to the barn. In the dark, I clapped my hands. I was glad that Sam was going to get a letter. But by that fall of 1776, I didn't have much time for pondering over Sam or Mr. Heron. Father was planning his usual trip to Verplank's Point, and this year, for the first time, I was going with him. It was pretty nearly 40 miles. I'd never been on so long a trip in my life. Sam used to go help Father, and after Sam went off to college, Father got Tom Warrups to go with him. But Tom was busy, and so this time Father had to take me. Verplank's Point was on the Hudson River, just south of a town called Peekskill. Boats from New York City and Albany stopped there for trading. The idea of our trip was to drive cattle to Verplank's Point, where we could sell them and then use the money to buy supplies we needed for the tavern and the store. Rum, cloths, pots and pans, needles and thread, and all sorts of things. The traders brought these things up the river from New York and sold them to merchants at towns along the way, like for Planks Point. And of course, the merchants there wanted cattle to ship down to New York, where there was a need for beef. In October, Father began gathering cattle. Some he got from farmers who paid their bills to him with cattle every year. Some he just bought, knowing he could sell them at a profit. It would take us 3 days to drive the cattle over and 3 days to come back. On horseback, you could ride it in a day, but we'd have not only the cattle, but the wagon drawn by oxen with us. Going over, we'd have a few pigs in the wagon. Coming back, we'd carry the things we bought in it. On the way, we'd stop at places where Father knew people. One night we would spend with those cousins of mine I'd never met. Father always stopped at the same places. They expected him every year. It was a good chance to catch up on family news. The trip was planned for the end of November. It was best to go late in the year as you could, because the closer to winter it was, the scarcer beef was, and the higher the price you could get. But if we waited too long, it would snow, and then we would have trouble. Most of the time it was easier to travel when the snow was on the ground. You just hitched a horse to a sledge and slid over the packed snow. But it was too hard to drive cattle in the snow. It was hard to pasture them along the way, too. So about the beginning of November, Father began keeping a sharp eye out on the weather. He consulted some almanacs, which usually disagreed, and he asked certain farmers who were supposed to be good judges of weather when they thought the snow would come. But the weather judges didn't agree any more than the almanac did. So in the end, Father would go out and frown at the sky a dozen times a day and then make a guess. The truth is that Father didn't really want to take me. "I don't think you're big enough yet to handle the wagon," he told me. "I know how to handle the wagon, Father. I've done it lots of times." "Around here, yes, but not with 30 cows to look after as well. Besides, the woods are full of those cowboys over there. They claim they're patriots, gathering beef for the troops, but really, they're nothing more than thieves, and we don't have a gun anymore." Father was right about the thieves, who people called cowboys. We've heard all kinds of stories from travelers about them. All of that part of Westchester County, from the Connecticut border over to the Hudson River, had gotten to be kind of a no man's land, with roving bands wandering around and plundering people on the excuse that they were part of the war. "I'm pretty brave, Father," I said. He shook his head. "I don't like taking you, Tim, but I have no choice. There's nobody else to do it." I was glad there was nobody else to do it. It was pretty boring hanging around the tavern day after day, making fires and chopping wood and cleaning up and looking after the chickens and old Prue and the pigs. There would be a lot of exciting things on the trip. Meeting my cousins and seeing the Hudson River, which they said was a mile wide, and watching the boats sail up and down it. Besides, it would get me out of school for a few days. So Father collected cattle and watched the weather, and on the 20th of November, he came in from his weather look saying, "It's cloudy and getting chilly. I think we better start off in a day or two." It was a good guess. When we started out 2 days later, there was a half an inch of snow on the ground, which had fallen during the night. The sun came up later on and melted it, making the roads muddy, especially after the cattle had churned it up. I walked alongside the wagon, guiding the oxen and keeping them moving when they slowed down. We had 4 hogs in the cart with their feet tied together. They were always trying to get out, and I had to make sure they didn't get loose. Father rode our horse, Gray, along behind the cattle to keep them moving. We went pretty slowly. There wasn't much to do except to look around at the hills and fields. It seemed pretty exciting when we passed a house, especially if there were some people there. A couple of times there were children staring out the windows as we went by. It made me feel proud of myself for being a man while they were still children, and I shouted at the oxen and smacked them on their rumps with my stick just to show off how casual and easy I was with oxen and how used I was to managing them. Father's plan was to go up through Redding Ridge to Danbury and then turn a bit southward, to go through Ridgebury and across the border into New York, where we'd spend the night in North Salem with our cousins. We'd spend the second night with friends of Father's at their farm near Golden's Bridge. It wasn't the straightest way over to Verplank's Point, but Father went that way because it took us past our cousin's place. We reached Ridgebury around lunchtime. We didn't stop to eat, but chewed on some biscuits and drank some beer for thirst as we walked along. We couldn't have a conversation, really. The cattle made too much noise as they tromped along mooing, and we had to shout to hear each other. And that was why we didn't hear the men riding up on us until they came in sight over a little hill in front of us. There were 6 of them, and they were carrying weapons, mostly old muskets, but 1 or 2 of them had swords and pistols. They were dressed in ordinary clothing, brown shirts and trousers and muddy boots. As they came toward us, I began to turn the oxen to the side of the road so they could pass. But they didn't go on by. They charged up to us, surrounded us, and stopped. I knew they were cowboys. I pulled the wagon's long brake lever and whoa the oxen. The cattle stopped going forward and began milling around. I turned and looked back at Father. He sat on his horse among the cattle, looking very calm. "What's this?" he said. One of the cowboys pushed through the cattle to get close enough to Father to talk. "What's your name?" "What business is it of yours?" Father said. I was hoping Father wouldn't argue with the man. It scared me. "Government business," the cowboy said. "No doubt," Father said. "Answer the question or we'll hang you and the boy from the nearest tree." "My name's Meeker," Father said. "Where from?" "Redding." "Redding?" The man turned in his saddle and spit onto the muddy road. "Tory country," he said. "I suppose this cattle's going to end up in lobsterback stomachs." Father shrugged. "Where it ends up, I don't know, and I don't care. I've been selling my beef at Verplank's Point for 10 years, and I haven't yet asked who is going to eat it." "Times have changed, Meeker. Now we want to know who's doing the eating, and we don't want it to be lobsterbacks. There's only one place where beef goes from Verplank's Point, and that's New York, and the British Army owns New York." I was getting pretty scared. He was tough looking. Father shrugged again. "I can't tell anybody what to do with a cow after I've sold it to him. That's his business." "So the point then is not to sell it to the wrong people, isn't it?" "I can't tell who. Get down off that horse, Tory." "I don't think I like being called that," Father said calmly. "Please, Father," I said. "Jesus," the cowboy said. "All right, if you don't want to get down from the horse, we'll knock you off it." He pulled a pistol from his belt and pushed his horse a few steps further until he was within reach of Father. "Father!" I shouted. He grimaced and shook his head. Then he got down from the horse. "That's better," the man said. "Now you and the boy walk out into the middle of that field and sit down." I looked at Father. "Do what he says, Tim. Go out there." "Aren't you coming?" "Go, Tim." By now the cattle were wandering all around all over the place. Some of them had gone up the road ahead of the wagon. Others were edging out into the pastures alongside the road looking for forage. I pushed past a couple of cows, trotted out into the middle of the field, and sat down about 50 yards from where Father was standing among the cows talking to the cowboys. I knew he was trying to talk them out of taking the cows. If we lost our cattle, we'd been in a lot of trouble because we'd have no way of getting rum and the things we needed to run the store and the tavern. I could see him gesturing, pointing up the road and then out to me as he explained something to the men. I wondered if he was scared. He seemed so calm and cool with the cowboys, but I wondered if down underneath he was really scared. I knew I was scared. Then I saw the man who had been doing all the talking lean down from the horse and hit Father with something. The barrel of his pistol, I guessed. Father put his hands up to cover his head. The man hit him again, and Father disappeared. He just dropped down among the cows, and I couldn't see him anymore. I jumped up, but Father didn't get up, and I still couldn't see him. "Father!" I shouted. The cowboys turned to look at me. "Please!" I shouted. "Please don't hit him anymore!" The men turned away from me. The man who had hit Father got off his horse and stood there beside it, staring down at the ground. I knew he was looking at Father. He was still holding the pistol in his hand. "Please don't shoot him!" I shouted. "Please!" This time, they didn't even turn around to look at me. The man on foot kept waving the pistol around. He seemed to be talking, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I stood in the middle of the field trying to think. Maybe I could run across the fields and find a farmhouse where they might be able to get some people to come and save Father. But if the cowboys saw me running, they could easily catch me in the open fields and ride me down if they wanted. I didn't know if I was brave enough to take a chance. The cowboys were still looking down at Father. I turned and began to run across the field. Behind me, I heard somebody shout. Then I heard horses galloping. I swirled around to look. The cowboys were galloping off down the road in the direction they had come from, leaving the cattle and the wagon standing in the middle of the field. I stared, and then a different group of riders came charging up the road from the other direction. There were a dozen of them, and they were driving hard. As they came up to the cattle still milling about on the road, they reined up sharply. Then most of them threaded their way through the cattle and dashed on, leaving two behind. I saw Father stand up, and I began running back across the road to the field. The new horsemen had dismounted, and by the time I reached Father, they were helping him to the side of the road. I ran up. "Don't worry, Tim," he said. "I'm all right." He had a bad cut on his head, which was still bleeding, and another smaller one over his eye. His eye was swollen and was going to be black and blue by the next day. He sat down on the ground while one of the men washed the cut on Father's head with water from a leather canteen and bandaged it with Father's own handkerchief. "Who were those people?" Father asked. "Cowboys?" "Cattle thieves is a better name. We had reports that they were riding this morning, and we've been looking for them all day. You're a loyalist, I take it." "I'm interested in making a living, not fighting a war," Father said. "My boy and I are just trying to get this beef to Verplank's Point, the way I do every year." "Verplank's Point?" the man grinned. "It'll go to New York then." "We'll see that it gets there. There are still a lot of people loyal to His Majesty in these parts." So they did. They waited until the others gave up on the chase and came back. And then they rode with us to the New York line. We waited there again until they got us another escort to take us further along the way, and we crossed over into New York. The first time I'd ever been in a colony besides Connecticut. It disappointed me. It didn't look any different. And I didn't feel any different either. Here I was in a foreign country, and it was just like being at home.